I'm going to ask you to forget everything you've been taught about making money for a few minutes. Forget that you need to know first how it's going to happen. Forget that you need to have the perfect conditions. Because there is a teaching that states something completely contrary to logic, that trying to figure out how you're going to get what you want might be exactly what keeps you stuck in the feeling of not having it. And when I first heard this idea, I also thought it was impossible, until I learned about the cases that have been documented.
In 1957, a completely ruined man put into practice a technique that Neville Goddard had been teaching largely in private for decades. Less than a month later, that man got $84,000 in a single day. His testimony exists, it is documented, and Neville even mentioned him by name and case number in one of his most important works. But there's a detail in that story few people mention. He didn't believe it was possible either, until he heard exactly what you're hearing now. And if you've come to this video at this exact moment, maybe it's not a coincidence either. You may have spent days, weeks, or even months searching for an answer without knowing exactly what you were looking for. And somehow, you ended up here. So let's start with something that almost no one is willing to do, even though it can be one of the most powerful actions you can take right now. You don't need a complicated visualization. You don't need a 15-step ritual. And you definitely don't need to turn your room into a spiritual laboratory. What you're going to do is so simple that your rational mind will probably dismiss it in a matter of seconds. That's exactly why. Make a tight fist with your right hand. Feel it. Feel the tension. Feel the warmth that appears in your hand. And while you keep your fist closed, repeat mentally or out loud, with all the conviction you can gather, I am rich. I am abundance. It's already done. Don't analyze it. Don't try to figure out how it's going to happen. Don't ask yourself when. Just say those words while you feel the pressure of your own hand. Keep your fist closed for 10 seconds. And if you can, do it with your eyes closed. Do it now before continuing. Because you just did something that Neville Goddard taught for decades as one of the fundamental principles for changing a state of consciousness. Not just making the declaration mentally, but experiencing it with your whole being. The tension in your hand. Well, it turned those words into a physical experience. And there's one of the central points of Neville's teaching. Feeling is the secret. It's not just the word. It's not only the intention. It's the feeling that accompanies what you're affirming. That's what you just caused. Now do something else. Write this in the comments. I'm already rich. It's already done. But don't write it like someone who's waiting for it to happen. Write it like someone who just remembered a truth that for some reason they had forgotten. Like a statement. Like a fact. Like you're signing for something you already consider yours. Because according to Neville, acting toward your desire before there is any physical evidence is precisely one of the deepest expressions of faith. And this is where it really starts to react. Because before I explain the method, before I get into Neville's teachings, and before I show you the technique that transformed the lives of thousands of people, you need to understand something much more important. You need to know the man who came to develop these ideas. I'm not referring to the generic summaries found on online profiles. I'm talking about his story. Because when you learn the details, you'll probably discover something uncomfortable. Neville didn't start from a privileged position. He didn't have all the answers. And his path was full of decisions that from the outside seemed quite unreasonable. In fact, many of the ingredients of his story might be present in your own life right now. Neville Lancelot Goddard was born on February 19, 1905, in Fontainebleau, St. Michael, Barbados. He was the fourth of 10 siblings and grew up in a family involved in trade. He spent his childhood under the Caribbean sun, living a relatively stable and predictable life for a middle-class family of that time. Nothing in that setting seemed to indicate that this boy would end up becoming one of the most influential spiritual figures of the 20th century. Nothing, except perhaps a characteristic that some people seem to carry with them from a very early age: the inability to accept that life has to be exactly as others say it should be. At the age of 17, he made a decision that would completely change the course of his life. In 1922, he boarded the SS Sari, heading to New York, with the intention of studying theater. He was alone. He didn't have a big safety net. He didn't know exactly what he was going to find, but he had something that in his case seemed to be enough to keep moving forward. An inner restlessness that wouldn't go away. And then he arrived in New York. It was the time of the famous Roaring Twenties, a city in the midst of a cultural and economic explosion, and Neville began to make his way as a dancer. He performed at the New York Hippodrome in 1925. He later worked in vaudeville. And finally, he made it to Broadway. A young man born in Barbados had managed to make his way into the heart of the American entertainment industry, thanks to his talent and his own determination. It seemed like his path was pretty clear. But during a dance tour in England, something happened that would completely change his priorities. There he met a Scottish man who lent him several books related to the power of the mind, and Neville started reading them. And something awakened inside him, something that would never fall asleep again. When he returned to New York, he was no longer exactly the same man who had left. The stage, the lights, and the applause no longer seemed enough to him. He had found a much bigger question, and he needed to answer it. So he made another decision that, from a conventional perspective, seemed pretty absurd. He left the theater. He left behind a career that was already beginning to become established. He gave up the applause and immersed himself completely in the study of metaphysics, mysticism, and esoteric scriptures with the same intensity with which he had previously studied dance. And it was precisely during that search that the teacher who would end up changing everything appeared in his life. In 1929, a friend had been insisting for weeks that Neville attend the lectures of a man who spoke in a small room in Manhattan on West 70th Street. Neville wasn't particularly interested. In fact, he resisted quite a bit. And he didn't have a very high opinion of the judgment of the friend who kept insisting either. But he finally gave in. Not so much because he was convinced, but probably because he wanted that man to stop insisting once and for all. He arrived late to the conference, sat at the back, and did so with the skepticism of someone who already thinks he knows exactly what he's going to hear. Then the conference ended, and something happened that Neville would never forget. A man with an imposing presence walked straight toward him through the crowd, looked him in the eyes, and spoke 3 words. "You arrived 6 months late." The man's name was Abdullah. Neville was left bewildered. He had never seen that man before. So how could he know who he was? And how could he know that he was late? Abdullah continued speaking with a calmness that Neville would later describe as the serenity of someone who already knows the end of the story. He told him that the brothers had announced to him that Neville would arrive 6 months earlier. He had been waiting for him, and now that he had finally shown up, he would stay there until he had taught him everything he had to teach him. Neville still didn't know that he had just met the man who would forever change his way of understanding reality. He would understand that later, when the results started to speak louder than any doubt. For the next 7 years, from 1929 to 1936, Neville studied intensely with Abdullah. He learned Hebrew, studied the Kabbalah, and learned to interpret the Bible in a completely different way. Not as a simple historical account, but as a psychological drama that takes place within every human being. For Neville, Jesus ceased to be just a historical figure and began to represent the awakening of human imagination. And from that study arose what he considered one of the fundamental laws of existence: human imagination. When it is charged with genuine feeling, it possesses creative power. And that power, according to Neville, was not reserved for a select few. It was within you. It had always been there. That was the secret he would end up teaching the world. In 1952, he published a small book. It only had 79 pages, without photographs, without statistics, without a cover full of impossible promises. Just 4 words. But those 4 words summed up an idea capable of completely changing the way a person understands their own life. Feeling is the secret. That book would end up influencing millions of people. His ideas would be taken up by spiritual teachers, entrepreneurs, athletes, and ordinary people who began to experiment with his principles. And they claimed to have achieved results that couldn't be explained using conventional logic alone. But Neville's entire system can be reduced to an extraordinarily simple idea. An idea that he repeated over decades of lectures. Your state of consciousness determines what you experience in your life. And that state of consciousness depends on just one thing. What really determines your experience is not only what you do, but the feeling you have made your habitual state. It's not your job. It's not your family. It's not the economy. It's not the city where you live. It's not even what you studied or the circumstances you were given. According to Neville, what matters is the feeling you keep returning to. That inner state is what determines which opportunities you recognize, which ones you pursue, and which ones simply pass by without you even noticing them. And here is what's truly interesting. If you change that habitual feeling, everything else starts to change along with it. Not necessarily tomorrow, not after years of working on yourself, but from the moment you adopt a different state. Because in Neville's teaching, the subconscious does not operate in some hypothetical future. It works from the present. That's why when your current state changes, the way you perceive, interpret, and respond to the world also begins to change. Neville used a very simple image to explain this, and his students hardly ever forgot it. Imagine that your outer reality is a mirror, an absolute mirror, a faithful one. It doesn't negotiate with you. It doesn't try to flatter you. It simply reflects what's in front of it. If you stand in front of it with a constant feeling of lack, that's what you'll recognize in your experience. But if you change the state you're living from and start to experience a genuine sense of abundance internally, the reflection starts to respond to that new state. The problem is that most people try to modify the reflection directly. And that's where the mistake is. They work more hours. They buy another course. They look for a new strategy. They change their method every 2 weeks. And they hope that somehow the mirror will obey. It's like trying to change your reflection by pushing it with your hand. You can do it all day long, but the mirror won't cooperate. First, you have to change activities.
Que está frente a él.
That was the principle behind the method that Neville taught for decades. Now we'll move on to the practical part, because it's one thing to understand the idea and a completely different thing to know how to use it. The technique that Neville taught is known as the state akin to sleep. And according to him, this state was especially powerful because it happens right at that moment, in that strange place between wakefulness and sleep. Your eyes are already closed. Your body starts to relax, but a part of your consciousness still remains awake. At that point, critical thinking begins to lose intensity, and the mental barriers that normally question anything that contradicts your usual beliefs become much less rigid. That's where imagination comes in. What you imagine with true feeling can be experienced internally with an intensity that resembles a memory much more than a simple fantasy, like a seed falling onto soil that is already prepared. Now then, how is it applied? First step, build the scene. Before you go to sleep tonight, decide exactly what you want to experience. And here, Neville was quite strict. No vague images, no vague desires. You need a concrete and brief scene, which would only make sense if what you desire had already happened. There's a huge difference. Don't imagine the money coming in. Imagine what you would do after you've received it. If you want to receive an unexpected amount of money, imagine yourself holding it and counting it. If you want to eliminate a debt, imagine a conversation with someone close to you in which you tell them that you finally paid everything off. The scene has to be short, specific, and above all, it has to create a feeling that's real enough so that when you finish imagining it, your body still holds on to that emotion. Second step, enter the state akin to sleep. Lie down, close your eyes, breathe slowly several times, and let each exhale reduce the tension accumulated during the day. Second, you don't need to force anything. Let your body become heavy. And when you start to enter that pleasant feeling of drowsiness, replay your scene. But there's something fundamental. Don't observe it from the outside. Don't imagine yourself sitting in a seat watching a movie about your own life. Live it from the inside, through the eyes of the person who already got what they wanted. Feel the object in your hands. Listen to your own voice. Notice the details. Feel how your body changes when you're no longer carrying the worry that once seemed inevitable. If you're imagining money, feel the weight of the bills. If you're imagining a conversation, listen to the words. If you're imagining a new situation, experience what it would really be like to be inside it. Use all the senses you can. And when you are completely inside that experience, repeat mentally, calmly, "It is done." You don't need to shout it mentally. You don't need to convince anyone. The idea is to feel like it already happened. Third step, persist in the feeling, not in the technique. This is one of the most common mistakes. The person does the exercise at night, plays out the scene for a few minutes, and then, the next morning, goes right back to the same mental state as always. For the rest of the day, he thinks about everything he lacks. He worries. He gets desperate. He checks his bank account. And then he wonders why the technique isn't working. Neville emphasized something much deeper. An assumption held for long enough can end up becoming a concrete experience. But the key is to maintain the state. Don't obsess over mechanically repeating the scene. Don't turn it into a task you have to complete. The real work is to return again and again to the feeling of someone who already lives in that reality. During the day, when the thought of what you still don't have appears, pause for a moment and consciously return to the state you experienced the night before. not just as a simple visual memory, as an inner state, like the emotional state of someone you already know. You consider natural what once seemed impossible. And to understand just how much Neville trusted in this principle, it's worth knowing some of the testimonies he himself shared in his books. One of the most well-known appears in The Law and the Promise, published in 1961. It's the story of a man who regularly attended Neville's lectures in Los Angeles. When he arrived at one of them, he was in a situation that many people would immediately recognize. He had no money. He was completely broke. He had listened to Neville's teachings for months, but until then, he had mainly understood them on an intellectual level. He knew what he had to do. The problem was that he still hadn't done it with true conviction until that night. Something changed. The wall of skepticism that had been blocking him for a long time finally gave way, and he decided to really give the method a try. That very night, before going to sleep, he closed his eyes and entered the drowsy state that Neville had described. Then he began to replay a very specific scene. He imagined himself in front of the payout window at the Caliente racetrack, holding winning tickets in his hands. He didn't just visualize the moment. He tried to feel it. He felt the tickets between his fingers. He experienced the excitement in his chest. He felt those chills you get when you've just discovered that something extraordinary has happened. And he repeated that experience night after night, not from the desperation of someone who hopes it will happen, but from the feeling of someone who had already lived that moment and was simply replaying it internally. Several days went by. Then he went to the Caliente racetrack, and something quite peculiar happened. By mistake, he ended up making 6 additional tickets exactly the same as the ones he had already prepared. His hand duplicated them before his mind had time to question it. And in the last race, something even stranger happened. He made another mistake and ended up duplicating 2 tickets. When they finally announced the results, that man had 2 winning tickets for the toughest betting pool at the track. Each one paid $2,000. In addition, he had 6 other consolation tickets. The total came to $4,000 in a single day. He had started without a penny. And, according to the testimony presented by Neville, everything had happened after spending several nights imagining the feeling of already having what he wanted. The story was published under the initials TCK, and Neville presented it as one of the examples of how an imagined and sustained experience could end up influencing a person's actions without them having to consciously plan every move. But the case of the Caliente racetrack was not the only testimony that Neville shared. In the same book, there's another particularly interesting case. This time, it was about a doctor from Chicago. At a time when the market was in an extremely complicated situation, this doctor needed $250,000 to start a company dedicated to specialized technical instruments. The problem was obvious. He didn't have the money. And, according to the story, he couldn't find any person or institution willing to provide it either. From a purely logical perspective, the situation seemed practically impossible. The doctor called Neville from Chicago in May of that year. He explained that he was too close to the problem to imagine a solution clearly. The negative comments from brokers, bankers, and people around him had ended up taking up so much space in his mind that he could no longer visualize the outcome he wanted. And Neville did exactly what he usually did. He didn't promise him things would be fine. He didn't try to convince him with empty words. And he didn't give him an explanation about how the money was going to appear either. He taught him to change the perspective from which he imagined. Instead of asking himself how he would get the $250,000 he had, to start internally experiencing the state of someone who already had them available, not with anxiety, not with desperation, not figuring out where they'd come from, but with the calmness of someone who, in his imagination, had already crossed that barrier. In less than 2 months, the money arrived, not from a single source, but through a chain of events that seemed like simple coincidences. Neville called this the bridge of incidents, the path that reality builds between your current situation and the state you have assumed to be true. And, according to Neville, that bridge is built no matter who you are or where you come from. Now you understand why this message seems to arrive just when you need it. Most people hear these ideas, consider them too simple or too mystical, and dismiss them. And then they keep living exactly with the same belief they had before. But there is a minority who hear this and experience something different, a feeling of recognition, as if they weren't discovering something new, but remembering something they already knew. If you're feeling that, you don't need to convince yourself of anything. You just need to experience the principle. And maybe you've tried to visualize before. Maybe you've repeated affirmations and haven't seen results. That may have created a voice inside you that says, "This time it won't work either." But Neville would have responded with something very simple. The law did not fail. The problem was the state from which you were applying it. You can repeat words for hours, but if deep down you still feel scarcity, it's the words that lose to the feeling. And this, far from being a condemnation, is good news, because it means you don't need to change your whole past to start over. You can change the state you're living from right now. Neville Goddard was born in Barbados in 1905 and died in Los Angeles in 1972.
72.
During his life, he wrote numerous books and gave thousands of lectures about an idea he never stopped repeating. Imagination, accompanied by feeling, is the true creative power. And if that idea is true, then you also have access to that power. So tonight, when you close your eyes, don't imagine that someday you'll have what you desire. Live from the end, feel that it already happened. And remember, an assumption, even if it's false, when held long enough, ends up becoming a fact. The feeling is the secret, not the word. Feeling comes from the end, not toward it. Because your imagination is the instrument with which you build your experience. And if tonight you manage to feel what you desire as real, you might discover that the first change doesn't happen outside. It happens inside you. And from there, everything begins.